Is the Greek crisis for you economists a test tube case, a case of experimental economics?
I think I would say that the euro area as a whole is a test case. We've had a situation, you very rarely get clear-cut tests of fiscal policy because governments rarely make large changes in fiscal policy. In this case, we're seeing big changes because of debt fears, austerity, so it has been an unusually good example. It's not pure experiment, obviously. It's not a clean experiment even in those terms, and obviously there's a lot of things that matter. But no, I will be dishonest if I didn't say that one of the very small side benefits of the crisis in Europe has been that it gives us an opportunity to test economic theories.
Does that mean that economists are possibly a good advisor to government or a less good advisor because they are so much interested in the experimental side of it?
Well, I can't think of anyone who has advocated a policy because he thought it was a good experiment as opposed to because he thought it was a good policy. And let me say that the results of the experiment have sadly rather strongly confirmed the theory that many of us went into it.
How do you evaluate the policies of the now resigned government of Alexis Tsipras since the last general election in January?
Well, the trouble was that Tsipras staked everything upon being able to get a better deal from the Troika. And then when the Troika refused, he was unwilling to take another step. There was no plan B. So if you had told me in advance that what he would do would be to create an air of crisis and then when actually faced with the refusal of the other side to give any ground, completely fold, that was not positive. The end result was that there was a period of disruption that I think is probably less important than people think, but still there was a period of disruption that hurt the economy at least a little bit, and nothing was gained.
And how do you assess that cost to the economy? You said not as bad as many people think.
Yeah, available data suggests that the economy did not contract as much as many of the horror stories suggested, and for what it's worth, those effects will fade out quite quickly now. So there are people with a great interest in exaggerating the damage that was done. Greece was not, in fact, on the road to recovery before the Syriza took power. It was showing a slight upturn, but it was nothing like a real recovery. So if you think that everything would have been fine without this confrontation, that's wrong.
It did have a couple of positive quarters last year.
That's not surprising. I mean, from the beginning, we always said that if a country did austerity for a very long time, it would eventually have deflation sufficient to make it more competitive, and there would be a slow comeback. But
isn't that the question? Competitiveness?
Well, you have to be careful about what we mean by that. So I do not, if competitive means, if when you say competitiveness you mean that, oh, there can be no recovery until Greece has German levels of productivity, that's nonsense. It's not really about the loss of, about productivity. It is about, in this case, just if you have a depressed economy, yes, wages will fall slowly over time. You will become a cheaper place relative to the rest of the euro area. So that we expected some recovery in all of the austerity countries eventually, but not much. And the trouble in the case of Greece is that although there are some underlying positive forces just from falling costs, the demands for ever greater austerity are frustrating the possibilities of more than a minor recovery.
What is the difference between Greece, that has not reached a recovery on the one hand, and other countries like Spain or Ireland or indeed Cyprus that have achieved that recovery?
The main answer is that although Spain imposed a lot of austerity, it was not nearly as much as Greece, and what's more, it's not continuing, it's not ever harsher austerity. Spain cut, but then the cuts more or less leveled out, and that's as the economy began to recover from that point. In the case of Greece, every time there's a glimmer of hope for the economy, the demand is raise the primary surplus by another 1%, 2%, 3% of GDP. and that means no recovery. So if you look, almost all countries that have started a recovery, they have not reversed past austerity, but at least they've stopped imposing more. But Greece is under demands still that it have ever more austerity. Now, there are other things. There has been a puzzling weakness. Greek exports have not risen as one might have hoped. So I will not deny that there are some structural...
Yeah, I mean, there are some structural questions like production and exports, and Greece seems to be in a dire position of having to restructure there in order to become more... No?
It would help. But the notion that Greece is so fundamentally flawed that it cannot have an export recovery, this would be something new in the history of economics. Demand curves slope downward for all countries. It's still the case that making Greece a cheaper place to produce, a cheaper place to visit, has a positive effect, and Greece has its own strengths. So you want to admit that there are structural problems, but those are not an excuse for the poor performance.
So what is the extent of what is the importance of structural change? What are the real needs for structural change in the Greek economy, in your view?
I would come back and say, look, Greece has labor productivity that is substantially below the EU average, which means that unless that can be changed, it will have, even in the best of circumstances, a standard of living that is well below the EU average. Greek wages cannot match German wages or even average EU wages as long as it's a low productivity country. But that's not a reason to have 25% unemployment. That's a reason to have somewhat lower wages. And it's the lethal effects of the euro and of the austerity policies that have made it so bad. I do a comparison now. I'd like to compare Greece with Poland. Poland is a low productivity country, lower than Greece according to most estimates, but it has not had a crisis. And the fundamental difference surely is the fact that Poland has retained its own currency. It was neither loved so much, there was never the vast inflow of money that took place during the good years of the euro, nor the vast outflow. So you should not, yes, Greece has structural problems. It's a low productivity economy. It should be richer than it is, but that's not why it's in crisis.
How about the importance of the fiscal situation? Greece is much more indebted compared to all the other countries, Spain, Portugal, or indeed Poland.
Right. Greece ran up a substantial debt, too large, should not have borrowed that much. It has now been, how do you deal with that debt overhang? And the attempt has been to deal with the debt overhang through enormous fiscal contraction. I mean, the amount of austerity imposed in Greece has been completely awesome.
What would have been the alternative?
The alternative would have been to get substantial debt relief right from the beginning, to say we cannot solve this problem by cutting. It was necessary. Greece was going to have to run a primary surplus.
Back in 2010, say.
Yes. It was clear that there had to be a path to a primary surplus eventually. But there did not have to be a path to an ever-rising primary surplus, and there had to be a point when you say enough. You cannot, no one can run a surplus as large as what the Troika has demanded of Greece. And the effect of that has actually been to worsen the debt position, because although the debt grows more slowly, the ratio of debt to GDP rises because the GDP is smaller. So this is it's almost like a Laffer curve. At a certain point, trying to do austerity is actually makes your debt position worse, and Greece is clearly on the far side of that.
What would be the right growth policy where we stand now?
I thought that the proposals that were on the table early this year, which called for essentially freezing the primary surplus at a small amount, 1% of GDP, thereabouts, no further tightening of austerity, and then major debt relief so as to make the debt burden sustainable given that relatively small surplus.
Okay, debt relief is on the cards. I mean, it has been on the cards since 2012.
It's never been remotely large enough. It's never been, I mean, the IMF itself says that that under the current plan, the debt situation is not sustainable. Now, the point is that if you could get that, then possibly the fact that Greece has already had so much deflation could lead to recovery. That was the hope. I think that was still a reasonable proposal in early this year. But if that can't be, if the creditors refuse to agree to anything like that, then there has always been a case that says that exiting the euro is a terrible disruption, but once it has happened, then you have the preconditions for a real recovery, and that should still be on the table.